that journalist asked, what's the link between testosterone and fertility? And I said, with low testosterone, you typically have low sperm. And then, I didn't know that they were going to put that in like an entirely, basically take it out of context. And that they asked like, what were the type of foods men were eating on these diets? I was like, lean meat and protein shakes. And you can see they extract the information, but you have no idea how it's going to be used or what dots they're going to connect up. That was probably the most disingenuous reporting.
Good morning, Joe. Welcome. We've got Joe Whittaker today. Thanks for being here. I've got everybody else muted, so just so you know, they'll be able to type some questions in the chat. We may get to those depending on what we end up chatting about. But thank you for being here. I want to just before I introduce you, I was there was a recent paper that you published or part of the publish, and it got pretty well recognized in the media. And there was a lot of, so one of the headlines was eating a lot of protein, eating meat causes men to become infertile was basically the headline, which I was like, this is kind of nonsense. And they basically referenced a study that showed that, you saw that higher protein diets in conjunction with low protein diets saw a reduction in testosterone. So from there, they said eating meat makes you infertile, which is obviously nonsense. But anyway, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself for the folks who don't know you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Shawn. I'm Joe Whittaker. Currently, I'm a nutritionist. I've been interested in health and fitness for going on a decade now. I first started around about a decade ago. It was paleo was very popular, so that's the kind of things I was reading. And then after a couple of years, I got a lay interest. I did a master's degree in nutritional therapy at the University of Worcester. And then since then, I've been running a clinic over here in the UK, online as well. And to be honest, most of my time is spent doing academic research. So I published 2021, I published a meta-analysis on low-fat diets and testosterone. And then the one you just mentioned, Shawn, I published that recently on low-carb diets and testosterone. And I've got a few other ones in the bag. Sorry, not in the bag, on the go. But yeah, that one was interesting because there were some pretty wild claims made off the basis of that study. The one that you just mentioned, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah. So when you said University of Worcester, I wasn't sure if it was England or Massachusetts because I wasn't sure. You're in the UK, so let's declare that up. I'm not even sure if there's a University of Worcester in Massachusetts or not. I'm not sure, but you're doing a PhD, and I think you said the focus is on testosterone and cortisol. Is that correct?
Yeah. Testosterone and cortisol, and branching out to like men's fertility, so semen parameters, things like that.
Okay. And what, let me ask you, there's a syndrome called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is kind of a genetic thing where people don't, XY chromosome people don't respond to androgen. There's testicular feminization syndromes and all these things that are genetic. But is there a degree of androgen insensitivity or androgen resistance that people develop, just based on, being obese and, having insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome? Do we see some of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Typically in obesity, the testosterone levels go down, but it doesn't explain everything because, testosterone is only one half the equation, really, but the androgen receptors. So I almost think you need a new formula, which would be like testosterone times androgen receptor density, and that would give you a more complete picture of kind of the overall androgen status that the cells are being exposed to. but on the specifics of your question, it's not something I've thoroughly researched, to be honest.
Yeah, there's, I just wonder because there's, like you and I had a conversation prior to this, and Stu Phillips did a study in I think it was 2018, looking at resistance trained men, and he saw that the testosterone level didn't seem to have an impact as much as the androgen receptor density with regard to putting on muscle mass. And so it's one of those things, and it's like just like there's insulin and insulin receptor, all of our hormones have their specific receptors, and if the receptors aren't functioning well, or if there's not enough of them, then the effect, no matter how much hormone you have, seems to be an issue. You had shared with me, and I looked it up because you mentioned that study on looking at postprandial testosterone. And there was a study that was done. It looked at soy, I think it was soy protein or tofu, I think, and then it was plus or minus fats, and it was I think they used like a plant fat, like safflower oil or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then they used fatty meat, and the only one where the testosterone didn't go down significantly postprandially was with the fatty meat. And so, and we're in it for a long time throughout the day. We're in this postprandial state, we're digesting for many, many hours afterwards. And so, again, we often measure testosterone as a part of an AM lab, which is, kind of a fasting level. But, again, it's 24-hour exposure. It is not where we're talking about testosterone rather than one snapshot first thing in the morning, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Shawn. Yeah, so there are other studies with that feed different types of meals to men, and see what the postprandial effect is. I'm pretty sure. Somebody should look more into it, but I'm pretty sure fatty meat, and the only other one I've seen is orange juice that doesn't postprandially decrease testosterone. And I was thinking about that because meat and fruits are very prevalent in hunter-gatherer diets, and so it makes ancestral sense that we would kind of, the postprandial effect of testosterone would be less. And then the other point on that study is even with the fatty meat, it went down a little bit, but less than the others. So it suggests, strongly suggests that fasting, or at least, time restricted eating, or intermittent fasting, whatever you kind of label want to put on it, that is probably, pretty good for, testosterone, general androgen exposure. And it's an interesting thing with the meat because it's definitely understudied. Like I would love to do a study where it's just you just gave guys like steaks and then measured androgen receptor density and testosterone and see what happened. But from what we've got, carnitine, which is basically found in dietary supplements, or it's found in red meat. That's like the only two sources. There's several studies showing that boosts testosterone, and there is a study that shows it increases androgen receptor density as well. So potentially if you're eating a lot of red meat and your testosterone might elevate, but then you've got the androgen receptor density increasing on the basis of that as well. On the wider point you were saying, Shawn, it's like testosterone, the biomarkers like testosterone being included. People like reductionists, scientists that just look at one thing and that's it. But looking at them in pure isolation doesn't really make sense. It's like, why do we even care about testosterone? It's like, you care about it because of the effects it gives you, like increased muscle mass, increased libido. And so it's somewhat like a proxy for that, in the same way that LDL's supposedly a proxy for heart disease. But if you've got a clinical signs of heart disease, there's no plaque in the arteries, it wouldn't matter if the LDL is high or low.
That's something I often talk about. You want to measure what you actually care about measuring, what's important clinically. And, yes, your biomarker numbers may go up or down, but what's happening at the end of the day. One of the, there's another thing. Well, let me ask you about that. The study, I think you talked about cortisol, and I think it showed, because this was a meta-analysis, if I'm not mistaken, And you saw that in the short term on a low carb diet, cortisol will be elevated. However, after 3 weeks, that becomes a non-issue for the most part. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's true. I actually have a sneaking suspicion that it decreases in the long run. Because I can't remember the results exactly, but I think it was a non-significant decrease. And it was just, it seemed like the studies that had the better low carb diets, like the more nutritious versions, seemed to decrease cortisol. So, maybe in the long run, it's actually beneficial. But the spike in the short term, it's not anything pathological. I was pretty convinced it was you just elevating just for gluconeogenesis in the short term, and then where you get ketones and you're more able just to burn fats via other pathways, the cortisol goes down because it's not needed to do that function. So it's kind of part of the adaptation process probably.
Yeah, there's cortisol. For those who don't know, cortisol is one of these counter-regulatory hormones. You've got a couple: cortisol, norepinephrine, glucagon, all oppose some of the roles of insulin with regard to breakdown of energy and substrates. Releasing energy from the cells, releasing glycogen from the liver, whereas insulin has sort of the opposite effect. And one of the things I think we saw that particularly around exercise, there was a prolonged increased cortisol. And so
Yeah.
what was the thought behind that? To me, I was thinking, because I know, like for instance, I don't eat very much carbohydrate at all. It's a little bit, many times none at all, but sometimes if I have a little bit of eggs, a little bit of dairy, there'll be a small amount in there. And I see often a very robust glucose response, particularly around intense exercise. And my assumption is my liver's just breaking down glycogenolysis, and I'm sure cortisol has an impact on that. Is it fair to say, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. I think I'd say that's pretty accurate. It does a few other things like one reason like it may jump up in low carb diets when you do exercise is because it's like trying to spare the actual glucose you produce for the brain so it doesn't get sucked up by your muscles. That's probably one of the reasons. But because cortisol, it's quite a complex hormone, like you were saying. And when it goes up, it's not like up is up is bad and down is good. Maybe in the very long run, but like those kind of spikes are more. I see them more like in 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 response to energy demands for cortisol.
Yeah, I mean, there's normal physiology and there's pathophysiology, and sometimes within a normal day, our normal physiology, we're going to have spikes and peaks and valleys of all these hormones. Everything is completely normal.
Yeah, and potentially with cortisol, because it has if it, I mean, a lot of people with autoimmune diseases do well on low carb diets, and maybe if cortisol is elevated, particularly after exercise, maybe it's having some regulatory effect on the immune system. Like it's it's promoting an anti-inflammatory effect, almost in like a natural way, as opposed to just kind of hammering it with exogenous cortisol.
Yeah, I've looked into some studies, and there's benefits to cortisol in our body. I mean, if we didn't have it, I mean, there's a reason for it. And I've seen, actually, in some cases, it actually improves mental cognition, mental health, mood. There's a relationship there. It's kind of not something people most look at. Most people consider cortisol, I think it's bad all the time because it's a stress hormone, but it actually has some actual benefits to us. Let me ask you about, because you mentioned at the beginning you did a study, a review on low fat diets and testosterone. What does that tend to show?
Yeah, so that one we basically took. They're in the high fat diets are about 35% fat, and then the low fat ones are about 20% fat. So dropping from 35 to 20%, you got about a 10 to 15% decrease. Interestingly, in that one, I didn't do it, but I should have done a subgroup analysis, but I did it after we published it. just to see. And there were 2 studies with low-fat vegetarian diets. So some of them were just low-fat diets, and then some of them were low-fat vegetarian diets. And then the ones that were the low-fat vegetarian, they're about 25% decrease, which I chalk down to. I mean, the low-fat diets are cutting out animal fat mostly, so maybe you get a 10% decrease by cutting out animal fat. But then the vegetarian diet's not only cutting out animal fat; they're also cutting out all of the micronutrients that you get from animal foods. Like zinc, or retinol, or even potentially vitamin D from oily fish. And so, if you're stripping out animal fats and all the animal-based micronutrients, you're getting that additional decrease in testosterone. But on the low carb one, because I would say it was, misinterpreted. And the reason we defined high protein diets 35%, and the reason is because there's that theoretical urea threshold. It's only based on one study, to be honest, but it's a fairly rigorous study, and above that is not well studied. So that's the reason we chose 35% as the cutoff. But in reality, I think what happened with like some of those media stories is that they didn't put that 35% into context, because very, very few people, even on what conventionally you would call a high protein diet, are gonna go above 35% protein. The general population is eating about 17% protein, but then people on high protein diets, as conventionally understood, they're probably no more than 25%. And then even if you take the carnivore diet, which is a higher protein version of a ketogenic diet, like fatty meat, if you're talking like ribeyes and fatty mince, it's only 30% protein in terms of the actual calories. It's 70% fat, and then most carnivores as well are adding additional fat in the form of egg yolks or butter or cheese. So that protein is going to come down to like maybe 25%. So in reality, the only people who are going to surpass that to any meaningful extent, it's just kind of, if you read something crazy on the internet, like, I don't know, eat nothing but chicken breast for like a year or something like that.
But that's, you look at a lot of bodybuilders, and these guys are eating a lot of protein, and I'm sure you may be familiar with the work of guys like Jose Antonio, who looked at pretty large amounts of protein in their diet, something like 4 grams per kilogram, 5 grams per kilogram for over a year. And, I don't think he studied testosterone. I don't think he looked at testosterone, but he certainly looked at kidney function and liver function, didn't see any significant issues there. And then when I look at these guys, bodybuilders that are eating pretty large amounts of protein, they're big muscular dudes. A lot of them are taking steroids, obviously, but not all of them. So, I'm just wondering, your point is, testosterone goes down, but are we seeing an increase in the androgen receptor? Is a number giving us the clinical outcome, on and on and on. But it's interesting, that I've heard the theoretical limit. I've talked about that in depth. I know that comes from some of the evolutionary biology. There's thoughts on that we would, that's what we've done. And this is something I remember when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I said, my diet's about 70%, 30% protein, eating a bunch of ribeyes, and everybody said, "Are you crazy? Ribeyes are mostly protein, and they don't understand it's by calorie," which was a big misconception. So I didn't specify by calorie, but that was my intention there. And so, and I probably, honestly, for me, it's probably been about 30% over time is where I tend to be, and it's as you mentioned, most people in the world, throughout the world, the diet tends to hover around 15% protein, which in my view is too low, but there's other people who would certainly disagree with that. With regard to, because you demonstrated about a 37% decrease in testosterone, I think, with the high protein version. What happens with a high protein, high carb version? Do we have any data on that, or have you looked into that?
I haven't done a review. I don't think there are any studies because when you do these reviews, you're obviously reading loads of abstracts. So I haven't come across any. But it was interesting. There's some research on where they basically showing if you give someone testosterone, it down regulates the urea cycle and reduces overall protein loss. And so from that study, I was thinking, maybe the decrease in testosterone is like preserving the protein for protein synthesis, because it would kind of make sense from the results of the other one.
Yeah, well, this for those people who aren't familiar with what is the urea cycle? Can you just explain that a little bit for people?
Yeah, sure. It's basically so when you eat protein, it breaks down to amino acids, and then amino acids have nitrogen, and the nitrogen forms up into ammonia. At high enough levels, it's toxic. So what your body does is it converts the ammonia into urea, which is non-toxic product, and it excretes it. And then the theoretical limit we were talking about is that up to a certain level, your body can exponentially increase its ability to do that. But then above a certain level, it's hit the max. It's like running at full throttle, and then potentially ammonia could build up.
Yeah, and so I've heard people talking about, they're on a high protein diet and they have a sense they can smell ammonia in their sweat or sometimes things like that, and so potentially it's building up in a little. At high levels, you see like people with liver failure. I mean, they have lots of brain issues and it causes uh, significant dysfunction. We see that in alcoholics a lot for some reason. Well, because their livers are damaged, but and so how does testosterone, what is the exact role? You said it downregulates your urea cycle. So what is the net effect of that going to be? Are we building
Uh,
toxic ammonia then, or what's going on with that?
I think it's complicated biochemistry. I don't know if I'm getting it exactly right here, but down regulates the urea cycle, reduces protein loss. Is it down regulates? Let me see. I don't know it here. I'll send you the study afterwards if you want to look. I think it's in the paper. Yeah, it's either cortisol down regulates it, and then testosterone down regulates it, cortisol up regulates it. So if you eat a lot of protein, and you're experiencing that reduction in testosterone and increase in cortisol, it's almost like a counter regulatory measure to upregulate the urea cycle, to help you excrete that nitrogen, essentially.
So in the media, I mean, when they, like we see these ridiculous headlines, like I mentioned, meat causes infertility, based on this study. How did that happen? I mean, did they interview you and did they just kind of make that leap? Or did you say, hey, it could have an impact on infertility, or where did that come from?
Well, they like typically they send a bunch of questions, and then so they like, for instance, that journalist asked what's the link between testosterone and fertility, and I said with low testosterone you typically have low sperm, and then I didn't know that they were going to put that in like an entirely basically take it out of context, and that they asked like what were the type of foods men were eating on these diets. I was like lean meat and protein shakes, and you can see they extract the information, but you have no idea how it's going to be used or what dots they're going to connect up. That was probably the most disingenuous reporting. There were others that were better, but I mean, when I did that paper, I didn't give it much thought. I just put moderate versus high, just so it's not clunky language. With all the hoo-ha with the media, if I did it again, I would put moderate versus very high, just to specify that, these are, fairly extreme protein intakes. And most people don't need to be concerned about receiving it.
And probably, I mean, and I can't remember, was it maybe The Guardian or something? I don't remember who ran the article, but I mean, it was probably more people will see that headline than will ever read your paper. I mean, that's, that's the sad thing about it, is they sort of use that opportunity to sort of put out something that, because you weren't testing for fertility, correct? I mean, you had no. I mean, the studies didn't have fertility as an endpoint, clearly, correct?
No, no, they didn't, not at all. I mean, they did have strength, and I did another look, and there wasn't any major change in the guy's strength levels. I mean, well, in one study it decreased a little bit, but it was only a short-term study on a low-carb diet, so it's still within the adaptation period. I tried to put, I mean, I put in the paper, like practical implications, and tried to, spell out, perhaps not clearly enough, but I tried to spell out, these are only extreme, these are extreme protein intakes. But it's interesting because on the low fat diets paper, I promoted that in the same way with the press, like doing a press release essentially. And that, it did get some attention, but it wasn't as much as this one. So I don't know whether there's some bias there in the media, that they seem to like that. Maybe that fit their pre-existing biases more than the low fat one. The only guys who covered it over here were the Daily Mail, who are kind of like the low fat one, who are they're like our right wing kind of controversial people who just run anything. Whereas, like none of the others cared about that. Whereas this one, for some reason, it was like, it made it to the US and then like some local news over here. I actually, because I thought, when I saw the meat headline, I was like, I was kind of like, I read it initially, I was like, that's interesting. And then I was like, that doesn't feel right. So actually, I tried to kind of curtail it by removing the press release and stuff, because I was fearing, is this just promoting disinformation now at this point?
It's interesting that you run a low fat study that's critical of low fat and crickets, but if you run a study that's critical of meat, for instance, it gets international headlines. It's kind of an interesting interesting thing. You said you had some other things in the works, or what other studies are you currently pursuing?
Yeah, the one I'm doing at the minute is super interesting. It's basically looking at dietary trends and the effects on men's fertility. It could easily be extended to women. So it's probably not news to anyone here, but the most significant change in diet since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago has been the industrial revolution, and then linked to that is the rise in processed foods. First starts off with increasing sugar and refined oils, but then it gets into the ultra processed foods, like chocolate, crisps, pizza, conventionally called junk food. And there's been some massive studies, massive meta-analyses that show that since the 30s at least, men's sperm has decreased, the concentration of sperm decreased. And it's a massive decrease. It's in the region of 60% decrease. And they're linear, so they don't see them stopping. So in 50 years' time, the prediction is it's going to be, nothing left almost. And so obviously the question is why? Why has this happened? Because genetics are constant, so or fairly constant. So it's not genetics. So it must be all these environmental factors. And what's got the most attention in the literature is endocrine disrupting chemicals, like chemicals from plastics, in particular, maybe like air pollution, things like that. But then nobody's really, to any serious extent, looked at the change in diet and how that has impacted fertility. So that's kind of what I'm looking at the minute.
Yeah, there was a study that actually Loma Linda did. The Adventist groups who are usually pro-vegetarian, they did a study on vegan men, and they saw a significant reduction in, I think it was sperm motility, basically, which is effectively making your sperm less effective. And so it saw a significant decrease among the vegans. But so what, so you're looking at it. I mean, are you seeing, do we have some studies that you can look at and say, like interventional studies say, it says that, if you eat X amount of this food, it causes your sperm to go this way or that way. What's out there currently?
Yeah. There's loads, but like a problem with a lot of the research is that they do it in isolation. It's like, for instance, they may say, they may do an observational study and link low sperm to meat. But the thing is, meat has not increased recently. Like the intake of meat is not exponentially increased. So it's like, how would that explain it? So it's kind of like you need to look at what has been linked, preferably intervention studies of it, if it comes to it, observational studies, and then see, what actually changed in the diet. One of the major things I think is the vegetable oils, because there's a lot of studies showing, if you look at the actual sperm, the guys that are infertile have a lot more omega-6 fatty acids actually in the sperm than omega-3. And if you look at dietary trends, like, something that stands out majorly, it's just, you just see vegetable oil just skyrocket, like on all the graphs. In the US, like soybean oil, palm. It's funny, it's like, because they're a major calorie source, and the top two vegetables in terms of quantity are palm oil's number one, I think soybean oil is number two, and of course nobody's drizzling soybean oil on the salad or palm oil, but if you look at the back of like Hershey's or Cadbury's or all the processed foods, that's the fats that they're using. So yeah, and they have those direct effects on sperm. On the testosterone, in the low fat paper, we looked just in the discussion. I thought it was maybe the lack of fat, but even more so an increase in omega-6. Because there's some pretty robust stuff in mice, at least, that shows if you give mice a lot of omega-6 fatty acids, they basically saturate the cells in the testes, and they cause massive oxidative stress, and just everything goes haywire. And they're like, if you measure the testosterone in the testes, it halves if you give them a lot of like soybean oil. Whereas if you give them, well, in that study particularly, if you gave them coconut oil or olive oil, so saturated or monounsaturated, you didn't get that effect at all. So you've got kind of, vegetable oils. It's kind of limited data, like piecing it together. But it looks like they hit male fertility on two fronts, on testosterone and sperm.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, the animal studies are always interesting, and I always have caution in extrapolating that to human data. But one of the problems, as you mentioned, is that it's these oils. No one's pouring soybean oil on their salad for their salad dressing. Although it may be in this, there may be some in the salad dressing. But the question I always say is it the fact that you're eating? It's just a marker for eating more processed food, because it's, like you said, it's in all the processed foods. Or is it that oil itself having a unique effect? And I guess the thing would be to take some people eating a relatively whole food diet and then add those oils directly in, in addition to what they're eating, and keep everything else the same and see if it does have an effect. Has that ever been done, or has anybody looked at that in humans?
I'd imagine it would have much less of an effect. Because yeah, I think it's definitely inextricably linked to the processed food consumption. They did in there was one in testosterone um, that kind of did what you were saying, and they still found a decrease in testosterone, like 15%. Um, I don't think it's ever been done kind of as rigorously as it should have. But it's been done in the mice, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess, again, when we talk about a decrease in testosterone with the caveat that we don't, what is its clinical effect? And so I guess the better study would be whole food diet, add the soybean oil or whatever you want to study, and then check, maybe look at sperm counts or sperm mobility, something that's an actual more of a hard clinical endpoint. How far along are you into the study, and is it going to be a review, or are you doing an intervention, or what are you doing with this?
It's like a it's like a mega review. It's I'm probably about 3/4 of the way through, and what I found is there's so many massive data sets online that you can just get and analyze as you wish. So like the US has some of the best data. So the USDA stuff, they've got dietary trends data that goes back to 1909. So it's incredibly long. And then you've got the UN. They got data from 1960 on all different countries. And I think from 1950, they've got data on all the fertility rates. And what you can do, or what I have, is you can look at, like, you can correlate sort of dietary trends versus fertility rates and see if anything hits. And it's pretty crude, but there is, like, there's some meaningful correlation there, which is, I mean, in terms of fertility, what's like major? It's something that I didn't really fully appreciate until I started looking into it. Is pre-industrial times, women had on average 5 or 6 children, and then after the Industrial Revolution, it goes down to 2 or 3, and that happens, before contraception methods are really readily available. Although they did have some impact, like early condoms and stuff. And it happens after as well. So I'm using Industrial Revolution like in a broad sense, like just kind of modernization. And you can see it happening here. Like if you take like Pakistan, for instance, they're still at like 5 or 6, but they're declining down to 2 or 3. And then, you can look at like China, over the past 40 years or something, and they've decreased. And it happened in Europe and North America in the early 20th century. And that most of the analysis on that so far has been from economists and demographers. But nobody until recently has really been looking at it from a biological standpoint, because their kind of view was, like, the economists are just saying they just have less incentive to have more children. Like, for instance, the cost of per child has gone up, so therefore people have less children. But they never really considered, maybe there's a biological decline in the ability to reproduce, and that's explaining some of it. And as I was saying before, a lot of people looked at that on the in terms of exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is you mentioned Pakistan, but even though India is poised to be the most populous country in the world, I think by 2030 they're going to surpass China at about 1.4 billion. They're actually having issues with fertility in India, which most people probably wouldn't be aware of. But if you look into it, they're having issues with fertility there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think somewhere around the 1960s is when the human population was at its peak growth rate. I mean, we're still growing as a whole, but we peaked in the 60s, and the rate of growth in human population has actually gone down since that time fairly significantly. And even though we're growing as a species, it's not as fast as it was in the 1960s. The other thing is that with the advent of the agricultural revolution, we saw a boost in our fertility and allowed us to grow these. We went from a world population of a few million to, where we are today. And a lot of that probably had to do with agriculture providing more food for everybody, with some of the problems that came with it to individual health. But do you see any, well, like I said, when it comes to fertility, do you see that bear out? I mean, people eating an agricultural based diet, which would be largely a grain based diet, that's pretty much what agriculture added to us versus a hunter gatherer diet. Do we know what native hunter gatherer populations, their fertility rates are, their rate of having children? Is that known?
I think they're fairly similar. I think maybe slightly higher than agricultural, but I think it's fairly similar. Yeah, I mean, they do breastfeed for longer, so it does kind of give a natural contraception. So maybe if they didn't maybe if it was comparable in terms of breastfeeding, because in agrarian societies generally they breastfeed a bit less, so they can get pregnant. So knock-on effects, they get pregnant earlier. But I mean, when we're talking about fertility rates, it's only live birth. So a lot of those kids, like in agrarian societies, they don't survive. Maybe they die in childbirth for the first year, whereas probably the hunter gatherers, I would imagine that they have. I know they do have high infant mortality rates, but one would think that they're having more robust children, just because their parameters of health generally exceed agricultural societies.
Yeah, I mean, I've read that on average, a hunter-gatherer's breastfeeding time is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.5 years. Whereas obviously most women that have babies these days, I mean, 6 months to a year is pretty typical. Some will continue to breastfeed longer, but it's not. I don't think it's as common as it is with these hunter gatherers, where 2.5 years seems to be the sort of the norm. Do you find that as far as is it hard to get? You'd mentioned you want to do a study. I know you mentioned you want to do a study comparing a meat-based diet versus a plant-based diet. Are you finding any support for doing something like that?
It's very early days. I'm kind of beholden to other people, but potentially, one of my lecturers at a university, she wants to run a study, and she works with this mental health charity, but she doesn't kind of think she wants me on board to help out essentially, and but my interest in mental health, well, not strictly. So we kind of spin it a bit. In an ideal world, I would like to do vegan versus paleo versus carnivore, and then look at all of the endocrine stuff, like the testosterone, but also like free testosterone, DHT. And then if you could do it as well, androgen receptors, because it's a bit more tricky to test just because you got to do biopsies, which is not a major thing. And basically just see what happens in terms of all those diets, and do it in like a rigorous, RCT manner. And then, you could, because a lot of those things have, androgen receptor density is like, not well suited at all in terms of diet, in terms of whole food diets. So you get some, unique data from that. But then you could also correlate it to mental health outcomes, because testosterone and depression, that's like a big area. But then as well, I don't know, I've never actually, Google scholared it, if androgen receptor density has ever been looked at in terms of mental health. So, there could be a hypothesis like a high meat diet, via carnitine and other micronutrients increases androgen receptor density. What effect does that have on testosterone? But then maybe it elevates people's moods, and then you could see, does the increase in androgen receptor density correlate to the increase in mood or the increase in quality of life? See, that's the direction I'm thinking.
Yeah, there's a 2018 paper out of Stanford looking at major depressive disorder, and they looked at carnitine levels. And so serum carnitine levels were basically directly proportional or related to, major depressive disorder. So those with low carnitine had a much higher incidence of major depressive disorder. And as you know, carnitine is, we make some endogenously, but we tend to, if we don't ingest it, it tends to be much lower. And so, and carnitine is almost exclusively found in animal foods. I think things like, I think asparagus has a little bit, but I mean, for the most part, you're not going to get carnitine outside of an animal source diet. So there is at least that relationship. And then, other dietary factors with mental health. I mean, you've got zinc and you've got iron levels and all kinds of things, which all probably have a role on, our hormones too, most likely, for sure.
Yeah, I do. I have had some thoughts about DHT because, at least in some of the tissues, I don't know if this is getting a bit into the weeds here, but at least in some of the tissues, testosterone, like the prostate, testosterone doesn't do that much. It has to be converted to DHT, and that exerts a much more potent effect. So I wonder, in other tissues, maybe, has it been established that testosterone is the major player, or does it have to be peripherally converted to DHT? In the same way the T4, T3, T4 is like the reservoir, but mainly to exert its effects, it's turned into T3. And then that study you sent with the Stuart Phillips one, showing like androgen receptors look much more important than basal testosterone. It's like, maybe maybe another factor in the equation is like the peripheral conversion to DHT. That's just a kind of hypothesis off the top of my head, but it would be something interesting.
Let me talk about the prostate, because a lot of men will develop prostate cancer. Most of them will die with it and it won't kill them, but it's very common. And does testosterone have a negative? Because one of the treatments for prostate cancer are things like Lupron or finasteride to knock down testosterone. What's going on with testosterone in the prostate? Do we need to be worried about that?
I say no. The biggest meta-analysis on it, just observational, that they didn't find any association. In the past, yeah, they have found, but I think it was just a case of, we found it in this study and then we didn't find it in this study and that one didn't get cited. Hence the reason for like systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I think I mean, there is obviously, it does have a role in terms of like progressing prostate cancer when it's actually there, but actually like having basal levels of testosterone higher, I don't think that doesn't have any effect. I don't think.
Yeah, one of the things we often see with testosterone, as it's a diurnal hormone. It peaks early in the morning and then it kind of drifts down throughout the day, and then of course it responds to different stimuli. But one of the concerns that people have are that if the testosterone, I guess this again, I'll go back to Stu Phillips. There was a thought about, exercise causes an increase in testosterone, if you're exercising, but that's not been shown to have an impact on muscle protein synthesis. This is kind of one of those things where it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. And it's kind of trying to figure out, where it plays a role. And like you mentioned, it may be just the 24-hour exposure that we have throughout the day that has an impact. Have you seen anything where correlating exercise, types of exercise, testosterone levels, and then anything else with regard to that?
I did see some stuff on post-exercise testosterone and androgen receptor density, and they found, I believe, the higher the post-exercise cortisol, the more the androgen receptor density increased. So, because, I mean, it must be doing something, because it goes right up. In the same way that cortisol goes up. So, it must have some role. I mean, maybe it's not on hypertrophy, but maybe it's on mood or, or some other function, or it's to do with I mean, it's probably unlikely energy balance or something. But it must have some role. On the that Stu Phillips paper, like it's like, I mean, you read it. It's like a highly technical paper, and they go over a lot of different debates within the literature. Guys who don't agree with them, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if it's settled or not. But I mean, at least according to the data and that, it seems to support that conclusion.
Yeah, well, okay, I remember what I was going to say. So, I mean, you can exercise to a point where um, your testosterone will be low. If you overtrain, like there's a symptom thought of overtraining or under recovering or something like that. And so you see that sometimes with athletes that are training extremely hard, that they'll see, I don't know if their testosterone gets used up. There's some thought that you're using it all because you're training so hard. Is that actually occurring, that it's actually getting used up?
Uh, it might be. I mean, there's the whole adrenal fatigue thing, with cortisol being. But I remember at university, one of my lecturers was basically kind of dismissing the idea that hormones can get used up. Normally, it's some kind of like down regulation somewhere, where for some reason the body's just not producing it. Um, at least because like the whole thing in functional medicine was with the adrenal fatigue and stuff. But if you search the academic literature, it doesn't pop up. But what does pop up is like all this HPA axis dysfunction. So that's what the clinically, like, people were finding, such and such set of symptoms labeling adrenal fatigue. I mean, they were right in terms of those symptoms were, kind of some kind of syndrome. They just put the wrong label on it, and it seems like HPA dysfunction, where hormones are getting downregulated or upregulated depending on different stressors. So what's going on? So I'd imagine with testosterone, it would be a similar thing. I'm going to look at it in another paper, because there's nutrients and stuff affect it a lot as well, like how testosterone goes up and down in regards to exercise. So I wonder if that has any explanatory role.
I've seen, I want to say, a study looking at dietary cholesterol and its impact on, I believe it was testosterone, or it might have been muscle proteins. I think it was actually muscle protein synthesis, but they compared a high cholesterol diet, which was about 800 milligrams of cholesterol, versus a low cholesterol diet, which I think was 200 milligrams. And to put it into context, 800 milligrams of cholesterol is, I think, a couple ribeye steaks, which is quite a bit of meat or eggs or however you want to do it. And they showed a significant difference. Does dietary cholesterol, I mean, it's obviously the precursor for a number of steroid hormones, whether it's vitamin D or pregnenolone or progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. Does it have a significant impact when we ingest it? Does it have an impact on our hormone levels?
Uh, I'm unsure. I don't think it does. Um, at least not from what I can see with the evidence. Because I mean, it would have. Sorry, I mean, I'll backtrack a bit. It does have an impact on overall steroid hormones, but there is like a prevalent theory: if you eat more cholesterol per se, it will give you more testosterone, um, which doesn't quite make sense, because I mean, it's not just testosterone that's built from cholesterol. Probably, I would hypothesize that if you get too low, like in a deficiency state, then yeah, I mean, your hormones are going to tank. Um, if you're like eating it above a kind of, if there was an RDA, for cholesterol, if you're eating it above that, I don't think you get additional benefits. But I don't think it's been rigorously tested, to tell you the truth.
So you would say that, let's say I'm on a medication that's lowering my endogenous cholesterol, what my liver's producing, by interfering with that, either statin drug or the newer one, the PCSK9 inhibitors, where you can drive your cholesterol down extremely low. Is that you suspect that would have an impact on endogenous hormone production, perhaps?
Yeah, that definitely does. Statins they definitely decrease testosterone. There was a meta-analysis on it. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that lens that you do need. Well, I suppose the evidence showed at the minute that if you go below a certain level, then your testosterone will decrease. But there's lacking evidence if you go above it will increase.
Yeah, so there's a deficiency, there's a normal amount, and there's a super physiological amount that probably doesn't make a difference. Which a lot of times we have this, well, if low is bad, then I'm gonna have as much as possible, which doesn't. There's usually a place in the middle. It'd be interesting if you send me that meta-analysis on the statin and testosterone. I'd like to take a peek at that. I am unfortunately, Joe, run out of time, but I want to again thank you for taking the time out to share this stuff with us. Love to hear about these other studies. If you get them done, that would be great to look at those. Where can people go to find out more if they want to ask you some more questions or find out what you're doing? Do you have some? I know you got social media on Twitter, but any other places to find you?
Yeah. Funnily enough, I don't actually. I barely use Twitter. I actually had to create that account, send those tweets, because I'm like, I like to be isolated, at least in social media. 'Cause you know how it gets. But if people want to find me, they can go to my website. It's joewhitakernutrition.com. Yeah, I mean that's about it. I mean, there's bits and bobs here, dotted about podcasts. If you Google me, you'll probably be able to find some stuff. But thanks for having me on, Shawn. It's been a really interesting discussion. It's been good fun.
Yeah, and good luck on your research. I mean, I think it's like stuff questions we'd like to get answered because I don't. I like when I talked to Don Layman about protein intake. And I said, what happens if you eat a pound of steak? Because I was asking about nutrient absorption. He goes, well, no one ever tests that because it's too hard, it's too expensive, and no one does it. And it's like, well, that's that would be a good thing to know rather than just protein powders, which so many of these protein studies look at. Anyway, thank you. You guys will be back tomorrow. Everybody, thanks for being here. Joe, have a great evening. I know it's evening time where you're at, and thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Okay, see you, Shawn. Bye.